All right, so hopefully at this point you're seeing a slide. Um, if not, let me know. But these are the slides for today. So we're going to take a look just quickly, for those that are new to AVD, like what is that and how does it work? What is the Arista validated design? And then from that, we're going to look at this test drive, this Arista test drive that allows us to use that content in a sandbox environment to build configurations using Ansible. But this would also work in your own environment. So if you have a lab with all the same components, or if you don't have a lab, you could potentially, work through your Arista team to have access to a test bed as well. So like if you want to, test drive an Ansible in this, similar type of sandbox, then that is also an option that you have available for you as well. And the AAP setup would be similar regardless if we're talking about a test bed or if you were building your own lab, in your environment, you would have to do a similar configuration on the Ansible side of things. And lastly, we'll go through and you'll see me with a demo that hopefully still works, right? Hopefully the demo gods are nice today, and we'll see this all work in action and see how easy and effective it is from an automation point of view. So this is the first part of it, and I will make these slides available afterwards. So I'll add this to an Ansible for Networking YouTube channel with the link to the slides, as well as to the Meetup site. So if you return to the Meetup site, you can always go back to past events. And in those events, in the comment section, I'll add the links to like slides, in the video replay and those types of things. So you'll be able to download a PDF of these slides and have these same links. But where I wanted to start is just, quickly, like what is the validated design and the content that represents it and how you can have access to it. So really there's two ways to access this content. One is through Ansible Galaxy, and the other is through what we call the Automation Hub that's available for existing Red Hat customers. And you would use your login from your subscription to access that particular site. So, two different ways to access basically the same content. And we'll talk about like what the content is here in a second. And if you're not familiar with using like if you're not a current Red Hat customer, or if you don't really know how to use Galaxy, I'll also add some links there and some like getting started with those environments too, just in general to help you out from that perspective. But I'm going to click in here. And this takes us to a Git repo, and this is the validated content. So the first thing that you'll want to do is, especially if you're new to this, is to look at the README. And the README will do a good job of explaining, why there's validated designs. In this case, we're looking at it again through the lens of, building a data center switching fabric environment and using, the Cloud Vision as the manager of that piece. But instead of using the GUI, we're going to use Ansible and, the roles from the validated content to make our provisioning configurations. And the other part of this is that there's a lot of different things too, in addition to that. So if you read through here, you'll see links, for a lot of different types of architectures that we're not talking about today, like MPLS as an example. So feel free to come back to this, to circle back for some of those other use cases that we're not really touching on today. So this is the high level part of it. And then when we look at the contents, you can see that, this is a GitHub repository, but it includes everything that is typically, from an Ansible side of things, it's put together in a collection. So if I go back to here, that's what we're referring to here. And within the collection, there's different types of content that you have access to. So if you're working with the Ansible core engine, just the command line, the open source command line, then you would need to install this collection in your environment that you're working from, where you're running the Ansible core engine. And then that would give you access to 14 different modules, 11 different roles, and 29 plugins. And then there are some, configurations that require additional dependencies to like, Python modules and things like that. So the collection does, like, it orchestrates all of this for you when you install it. But what you're trying to get access to is, when we talk about modules, then that's like the code that you're calling in your playbook, right? So if you create a playbook and a taxonomy of a playbook, when you define your play, you're talking about, okay, what devices do I want to connect to? So that's the host parameter. Do you want to gather facts if it's a server, yes or no? Do you want some play level variables, those types of things? But when you start to define what's in the playbook, you have to have at least one task or call a role. So when you define a task, you're calling a module, and the module is actually, because this is networking, it's normally a Python module that's available from that collection, right? So that's just one type of content, and that would allow you to automate depending on what it is, right? So in this case, we would have a collection of modules for CVP, and we would also have a collection of modules for the EOS, right? So those would be dependencies that we need to make available, to our Ansible environment to get started, right? Roles are different because those again are like the purpose-built playbooks. So these roles are very specific to like something like provisioning or validation. This is the intent of what you want to do in the system, and it's been packaged together so that you don't have to write your playbook from scratch. You can simply either install, import, or include these roles and then use them in your playbooks. Plugins are a little bit different, or a little bit harder to define, because there's a lot of different types of plugins. There's inventory plugins, there's filter plugins, so that you can extend like Python types of capabilities into your playbooks. Things like manipulating data types of filters for like dictionaries, or converting like syntax. Like if you want to take like raw JSON and then turn it into nice YAML, there's tons of things like that that are plugins. So to be honest with you, I don't remember what all the plugins are here, but if you wanted to, we could kind of look through that back in the repo and see what those are. And then dependencies again would just be like bits of code that need to be installed along with everything else in the collection. So once you have all this stuff, and it's very important, you have to have all this, this is the foundational piece to get started. Then you can start looking into like how would you configure your Ansible environment to use to consume this content. So here's some more links, right? So the first one here is like the high end, or the higher repo that we need to go to, GitHub repo. That is not our repo, right? So this would be a part of the Arista Net DevOps community repo, but we need to have access to it so that we can fork it. And why would we fork something? So fork is sort of like making a copy of an existing repo that we can manipulate as our own, because we would have access to that repo. We could read and write to that repo. And if we were developing something, then eventually we may do a merging of our fork back into that main repo. But we're not really doing that in this case. We just really would need the fork so that we can make our changes. So that's one way that we can just grab all of the test drive code, like the lab code that we want to use, playbooks and roles and things, along with the collection, the AVD collection. And it's basically an open canvas for us to make whatever changes that we need to make. So I'm going to click on that one just so we can bring it up. And where we are currently is in this AAP demo branch right here. So it includes playbooks that I'm going to use for the demo. So, but I'm not using, again, hopefully this doesn't confuse anybody, I'm not using directly from this repo. I've made a fork of it. So my fork is here, or I'm sorry. Yeah, this is me. And the difference here, and you'll notice, is see how it says forked from, maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger too, it might be hard to see. It says fork from Arista Net DevOps community, right? So this is like my fork copy of it. And when I click in here, you'll notice I'm 307 commits ahead of the official branch, right? So, and the reason for that is I've been making a lot of changes and doing things and trial and error. So I've done like a lot in my forked repo, but I don't intend on ever trying to, merge it back, right? So this is, basically like how you'd be able to just, run with this. It's at this point when it's forked, it's completely independent. So I could create additional branches in my fork too, right? So I kind of did that, and then I moved back to the master branch, which is like the main branch of my fork, and that's what I'm working from. So anytime I'm making these changes, and you can see I've made changes yesterday, 2 weeks ago, those types of things. These only exist in my fork, and I keep mentioning that because if you try to do this to their repo and one of their branches, you're not going to have right credentials to change anything on that side. And we want to be able to read and write. So we're going to make changes to these files as we're running through our workflow in terms of what the Ansible automation platform is doing to manage automation and automating, provisioning the CVP on the Arista side. And this will make a lot more sense, hopefully, as we get into the demo. So that is what this repo was. Now there's some directions. So two sets of directions here. So this first set here is more around, you have an environment. How can you use that environment to go through what they call the test drive or the ATD? So here we have this AAP markdown file that is a part of, their Arista Net DevOps community, from that Git repo, not my repo, but the Arista Net DevOps community repo, right? You'll see that there's this markdown file, which is a README type of file to give us directions. So let me go back just to show you, because that was a link kind of directly to it. If we start, and I didn't want it to go, I don't really want to go that far back. Hold on. I just want to go a little bit back. Yeah, so if we start from here, this ATD-AVD, you'll find that there's this markdown file, right? There's also a README file, but we want, at this point in time, we want this one here, the AAP. And what this will do is, it doesn't have a lot in here, but it reiterates what I said. It's like, hey, first off, you need to fork this repository if you haven't done so already, right? So that way you're working from your own copy of this repo. And then there's certain credentials that you're going to need to address, right? So in my environment that I have that's in a sandbox, I have a user and a password that was allocated to me, for that particular sandbox. In your case, it could be your own environment, what your credentials are. Or if you're using one of the sandboxes, obviously you would be allocated a different username and password than the one that I'm using. So we have to make sure that we identify these variables and where we would like to define these variables or make them available. So I did a couple of things a little bit different that we'll talk about later. But for this first part, it's basically the same thing. You will need your user underscore pass would be a password that's given to you in your environment. If you're using your own environment, you already know what that password is. So that would be uncommented. So this right here, they're adding, this var file, and what you may want to consider is, do you want it to be available in your inventory? Which you have to think about that too, because you have this forked repo. You might not want any of these credentials exposed as you're making changes, because it's going to ultimately, this could update into your repo. So you could do things like git ignore it, or just not define the variables in your inventory, because you're going to want your inventory to update so that your group vars and your host vars update as you're changing things. So what I did is I actually, in AAP, I'm going to show you that you can add them as extra variables or credentials in AAP, and then they never touch the repo. So you don't have to worry about git ignoring them or hashing them if you wanted to, like with Ansible Vault. But all of those things are on the table. You'll see, like, the way I did it is just like, for me, it was easier just to add them as extra variables. So another piece of this is, in addition to a password, there's some work that you need to do in the CVP. So once you have access to your CVP, you can create a token. So it's like a token that you go into from like your service account. And this token, you have to make that available somewhere. So in the directions, the option that's used in the directions is creating a self-service survey and then making it like the default answer for that particular variable that you're defining in the survey. That's one way of doing it. I just did it as an extra variable as well. So that never, this with the actual token is never saved, into my repo, right? So it's just things like that is where you have flexibility in Ansible to define these variables where you feel the most comfortable. So there's the directions, and then there's other ways of doing it too, depending on if that's your best practice. So one last thing here too on the CVP side. So we need to get a token. So that's going into the GUI to do that. And we'll try to navigate to that here in a moment so you can see like where I had to go. So that's one thing. The other thing is you have to go into your general settings. And so under the main settings, you'll go into general settings and you have to turn on this studios for end-to-end provisioning, because this will allow your playbook that you run in the Ansible automation controller to kick off, a provisioning. But what you really want to do, like as a step into the CVP, is you want it to be able to create this this workspace. So it's kind of like a workflow inside of the CVP, and it'll do all the things that Ansible tells it to do. And you'll be able to see, if it succeeded or failed and what the state of it is of your change. And then if it says it's good in CVP, then you should see it updated in your repo as well. And the repo would include some artifacts, like some configurations that were updated in our inventory. And I'll kind of table that for now because I'm going to actually, show you that in real time, and it'll make a lot more sense. So that was kind of like the last part of like the CVP side of things. Now on the Ansible side of things, there's a lot of prepping, to make this work. So on that side, there's this link here. And then what this link will do is it's giving you a walkthrough, but keep in mind it's a bit generic. So it's meant for like someone to use this really in a lot of different scenarios. So like if you already have an AAP, that's one scenario, but you may be using like our eval from Red Hat, a 60-day eval. So there's a link of like, how do you, get access to that and spin up an Ansible automation platform for 60 days. There's also a developer program where you have a limited number of devices that you can automate against, 20 of those, where it doesn't expire. So it's like this, it's more of like an individual developer license. So you as an individual can go there and create a developer license, and it gives you access to RHEL into Ansible. And then you can spin up like these lab environments that you can learn, more for like a learning experience. But if you want like the full blown production kind of capabilities, you can build them, but it would only last for 60 days, or you already have like an AAP with a subscription and all that stuff. So once you have that, obviously you have to start from there, right? And then once you have that, what this looks like, pretty simple. You've got AAP communicating over the internet to the CloudVision, to CVP, and then it has the ability to southbound configure your leafs and spines, right? So there's no connectivity, or at least this is how it is in this sandbox, right? There's no direct connectivity between my AAP and any of these devices that are running EOS. So there's actually something I was unable to do, but I can show you how to do it from the command line with Ansible to do the validations, because those require you to touch directly each one of the devices. So I'm only able to do the things that I can effectively use the collection for CVP. And, so I'm front-ended like with the REST API, and then everything that's, happening southbound. So I can't, directly do anything because of like, they're not proxy to me and things like that. Just connectivity, right? But AAP can certainly do the validation in your environment. If you have access to your leafs and spines, then you would be able to get it to work in AAP very easily. So some of this is just walking you through. Here's AAP, the dashboard, high level stuff. But here's where it gets into a little bit lower level types of things. So for this to work, I mentioned you have to have those, all the collections that you need. So you need to have CVP, the EOS, and also the AVD collection, right? The Arista Validated Design Collection. So to have that available for your AAP, you have to create an execution environment. So basically that is a container, right? So you have to go through some steps using a tool called the Ansible Builder, which if you don't have that, then you can pip install it because everything in Ansible is a Python application. And then once you have that available, you can go through these motions to create your EE that would include, all of the dependencies and collections and validated content that you need in order for all this stuff to work, right? So we won't spend too much time in here, but I do want to, I'd be remiss if I didn't also call this out. Like there's these directions that are pretty straightforward on how to do that, but there's some additional blogs that Red Hat maintains on how to build EEs. So I'll gather some of those links as well. I think I might have them already in the slide deck, but I'll double check it to give you some additional sources on how to do that step. And that's not just for this, it's just like a foundational thing that you need to learn for AAP anyways. So just to point out here, and I missed this the first time around, to be honest, is I didn't see that you could click on these other ones. So usually in these directions, they're telling you like, do this in a particular order, and then the next steps are, clicking into here, and you'll notice that the screenshots change, right? So I missed that, and I was like, these instructions are kind of light. It's like we're skipping a lot of things, but it was my fault. I just didn't notice that you could click on these, right? So that's building an execution environment. Once you have the execution environment, you need a project. So a project works basically the same concept as it does with Ansible Core Engine. You need like that playbook directory, and where are all those playbooks, located, right? So if we're running Ansible Core Engine locally, normally it's just a folder, right? And we have all of our playbooks, our Ansible.cfg file, maybe some templates and roles that we've created. All of that's normally, co-located together. When we're working with Ansible Automation Platform, or more specifically, the Automation Controller, normally our project is pointing to a Git repository. It doesn't have to, but it becomes very difficult to manage, a local folder structure, working with multiple people, building and changing playbooks and things like that. So we highly recommend source control. So not saying that there's source control in the AVD lab, like when you're running it that way too, because they do have it synced up with the repo. But here you really need to have it just in general, right? So this is pointing to your fork. So this is just an example here, but the link that, right here, the link that you're going to point to is your fork, right? So once you do that, you have access to all those playbooks and any content, right, that was available in that forked repo that you have. So you want to do that. And you also want to do this update on revision. So that way you're making changes, or eventually you'll be making changes, right? You want to pull in those changes every time before you run a playbook, because we're going to run a playbook, update some content, and then the next time before we run the playbook, we're going to read in that updated version of the repo. And that's infrastructure as code and GitOps and all that good stuff. It's just, a great best practice, and highly recommend, doing that. So once you have a project, the next step here is the inventories. So again, make sure you click around and see all the screens. But one of the things here that's kind of tricky, and in mine, I did maybe a little bit different than theirs, is I'm using an inventory source, which is my repo. And they do have inventory source down here, and they talk about what that is. So basically, the inventory source is how you're going to update your inventory in the AAP. A lot of times people will have like multiple options. Like sometimes they'll build some of the inventory in the AAP using a GUI, or they're reading it in from the project. And that's what we're doing here. We're going to read it in from the project. So if that Git repo changes something in the inventory, then we'll see those changes in our inventory source if we set it to sync. But then note that it's going to overwrite things that used to be in there as it's, learning new values for whatever's in our inventory. So that's all good. But what we want to also make sure is that, again, if we're going to do that and we're using the inventory, we're just going to make sure we don't have anything that's sensitive, in our repo. So we might want to move some of the things out of the inventory and then define them somewhere else. And that's what I was alluding to earlier. So here you need to set up an inventory like they did. You're going to source it from a project. you're going to find this inventory.yaml is actually in here, right? So if I go into, is this mine? No, that's not mine. This one's mine. Yeah, this one's mine. If I go into here, ATD inventory, this is what they're talking about. So we have to find this file. And you'll notice that mine's a little bit different than what you'll see in the documentation, because this is the public address for me to connect into that sandbox. Everything else is using private addresses, hence I can't connect to them directly, but I can connect to the CVP with this public address. So back in here, yeah, in here, what you're going to need to do is something similar, right? But you'll obviously, if it's in your environment, that's what you need to define in your inventory for that host. So if we look at host over here, you've got the CVP, and we can't really click into that, but I'll show you this in my lab. That's where it's reading it in, whatever that value is, and that's how it's going to connect to the CVP. If you don't change that, it's going to try to connect to 192.168.0.5, and obviously that's not going to work. So you would edit that on your side, right, in your repo, and you'll probably edit it using VS Code is the normal way of doing that, and that's how I'm working locally to make changes. Right. So once we have that, we can create what we call a job template. And a job template is how we run the playbooks in roles. Right. So that's what we're going to do to configure the CVP. But we wouldn't have access to any of these playbooks until we have a project and we have, synced with that repo. And then we'll see all of the playbooks. So we can navigate to them. And then we would want to run the correct playbook, which that screenshot is not the correct one. The one that we want is, or maybe it doesn't, yeah, this one, the CV_deploy role. So that one has a playbook that's named something CVP deploy, or maybe you just can't, maybe it doesn't show the last part of it, but I think that it'll be clear when I show you mine. You just want to make sure you point to the correct one. And then another thing that it's talking about here too is, you can set this in your repo because you can modify your repo, right? You want to change, or actually, I think the default is true. You want this to be, just double check this, but you want this to be true. I think this is how it is already in there. So that way, when you run through it, it's going to go ahead and make a workspace and go through that workflow. And you'll see that in action. Otherwise, it's not going to do that part. And you'll have to manually go in and tell it to launch the workflow from inside the GUI. So this way it's kind of doing everything as code. So they call that out. So I know, again, like just going through a lot of these files really doesn't make that much sense. So they'll make more sense when we look, but just keep in mind, these links will take you, into those instructions. The last part of this is, okay, I have my AAP set up and I can get to all the playbooks and roles, and I set up my CVP. What do I want to do once it all connects and works? So there are some labs in here. Let's see, or I'll just go back to mine, go back up to the high level part of it. Or now I'm actually all the way out of that, this one. I just want to go back a little bit. I think to the README. Yeah. So if you scroll down to the README, you'll see that at a certain point, there's these two different walkthroughs. Basically, we already just did this one. We walked through like setting up the AEP. This one is like the things that you can do once it's all running. There's different configurations you can change, and that's what I want to go through with you guys, is changing some of that. So as you scroll down here, you'll see that we're going to go in and we're going to modify some of the group bars. So there's all these different group bar YAML files, and that's one of the locations where we can define variables and make changes. So we're going to make some changes there, save them in the repo, and then our AAP will read them in, because when we pull down the latest change from the repo before we run a playbook, and it's going to notice that we've changed configurations, and then our configurations, the provisioning of them will change in the CVP, and we'll see all those changes. and we'll be able to actually go through and run the verification through the local repo that I have set up to just test, different assertions to make sure that, okay, we turned on OSPF, does it work? Do we have our neighbors? Those kind of things. So it's pretty powerful, because as we're making changes, everything's as code, and even the documentation and all of our artifacts, our files are being updated in the repo. So everything works as like a closed loop type of scenario. So I won't read through all this, because we're just going to go through some of them, and I'll use it, use some slides that I did some screenshots. But basically, it's just doing a lot of the basic configuration changes, and then we'll look at this validate, and that's where it'll look at the config versus doing some testing to make sure that the state of the fabric is good, depending on what we're looking at, like OSPF or something like that.